I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and region. I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians of all other lands on which our staff and participants are gathered today, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people attending today's webinar. So we have attendees from many different places today, so feel free to pop in the chat the lands where you are joining us from if you would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of those lands. So before we begin, can everyone please ensure your microphones are on mute and your cameras are off? For those who couldn't make it today, this CEBRAnar is being recorded. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. So you can either use the hand up gesture and then I'll throw to you and you can ask your question on screen, or otherwise you can put your question in the chat panel as we go and I will come back to it at the end. And you can also raise questions at the end that way. So a little recap for those of us joining us today. The Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis, or CEBRA, is a long-standing biosecurity research initiative currently hosted by the University of Melbourne. CEBRA plays a vital role in providing the Australian and New Zealand governments with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice that helps inform a range of biosecurity risk management activities. Today we will hear from their CEO, Professor Andrew Robinson, who will delve into the world of the department's compliance-based inspection scheme, or CBIS. A regular here in our CEBRAnars, Andrew is the CEO of CEBRA and leads the distinguished cohort of researchers that undertake critical research in the biosecurity risk analysis space. Andrew has a PhD in forestry and a master's in statistics from the University of Minnesota and is currently Professor in Applied Statistics at the University of Melbourne. Andrew is an elected member of the International Statistical Institute and has published an impressive, and I say impressive, collection of books, research articles, and CEBRA, which is the first iteration of CEBRA, and CEBRA technical reports on various aspects of risk analysis and biosecurity. So please join me in welcoming Andrew to chat to us today about CBIS. So thank you, and over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Jess. It's such a pleasure to be here today as CEBRA's official nerd-in-chief. As Jess mentioned, I'm going to talk about CBIS, which is the department's very successful compliance-based inspection scheme. I'm going to talk not only about that scheme, but also about some of the let's call it the packaging that goes around such a scheme, some of the states of mind that are necessary to embrace that kind of a scheme, and some of the consequences. Also, I'm going to post in along the way things we've learned about working with the department and working with a regulator, and how we've developed our CEBRA mindset, which honestly I think should be a T-shirt. So note to the team: CEBRA mindset T-shirt for the next Australian Biosecurity Symposium. Naturally, I have some slides because I'm a professor, and I'm going to pull those up, and hopefully those are coming through. I'm just going to assume
yes, all good.
That
we
they
can
are.
see them.
Thank you so much. All right. CBIS is a pocket-sized recipe. It's a pocket-sized recipe that sits into a much larger infrastructure, as we'll see, and necessarily. But the idea that underpins CBIS is a beautiful, simple little thing that we can talk about endlessly, honestly. I want to talk about not only the recipe, though, but also how it fits and sort of the challenges of getting it into a regulatory or operational system. So it's and I'm going to pass along the way some really important milestones around the ideas of risk-based intervention, which I think are perhaps insufficiently appreciated in certain areas. So I'm going to, and I'm going to be really interested in the discussion. I can't promise that I'll actually leave any time for questions or discussion, because as my team members know, that once given the gavel, I tend to gabble. So fingers crossed, anyway, there's time for a question or a comment or two. I really genuinely am interested in those. So where I want to go through is I want to go through a journey, starting with what is the border, which is actually not as obvious a question as it sounds, and why do we intervene at the border? And I think these two really set the scene for why risk-based intervention is a sensible direction to take. Then we're going to talk about CBIS itself, and then some other some corollaries of that. Okay, so Traditionally, in biosecurity, we've loved the idea that the border is like a wall. The border protects us from everything on the outside. The border, and I would say this, we owe this idea to the incredibly successful marketing that the Australian Quarantine Inspection Service, AQUIS, used to be an independent authority, delivered in the 70s or so, and inspired us with and fired us up with the belief that quarantine was protecting us from all evil things, all evil invasive species outside the border. And I think when AQUIS lost its sort of unique identity, I thought I actually myself I thought that that was a considerable loss of a valuable brand. But I came to realize that actually the brand itself might possibly be telling a misleading story about biosecurity, and that maybe it would be a good idea to think more deeply about what biosecurity is. So I want to push back against the idea that the border acts as a wall. And in fact, I think it's actually an unhealthy idea. And certainly from the point of view of risk-based intervention, it doesn't, thinking of the border as a wall is a disenabling concept, because if you think of the border as a wall, then you're thinking about it as being the primary means by which we're protected. I want to argue that increasingly that is not the case, that there are other mechanisms that are protecting us. And that has implications for compliance-based inspection, which is why this is all germane, and I'm going into this rather lengthy discourse about it. So in a nutshell, then, it comforts us to think of the border as a wall, but I also think that it disempowers us. So I want to guide us away or encourage us away from that mental model. I mean, and not least because, of course, this wall is an iconic one from popular culture. This is the wall that was depicted in the Game of Thrones. And as you know, it was unable to withstand the attack of merely one dragon. So the wall, and even in that case, was not a good solution. So what other mental models could we be using? And I'm going to borrow one from New Zealand for the moment, because they came up. Eve Playdell provided this nice graphic, which summarizes not just the border, but the biosecurity system as some slices of delicious Swiss cheese, perhaps with Swiss cheese with jalapenos, owing to those red blobs there, which I know they're supposed to be pests. Anyway, so the idea here is that the border is one of a number of filters. And I think this is a more satisfying model because it recognizes that we actually do a lot of things inside biosecurity that other than the border, that play an incredibly important role. And I want to argue actually that the border plays a role even more important than this might allude to. The border certainly is a layer in this sandwich, but it's a layer that has implications for how the other layers behave. So we'll come back to that though. But in the meantime, what I want to say is that the clear message that we need to embrace is that the border is permeable. The border doesn't stop everything. In fact, the border can't stop everything. And Beale famously said in 2008 that zero risk was undesirable and unattainable. And this is a corollary of that the border can't stop everything. And I think it's really important for us to keep that sort of overarching thought firmly in mind. These are examples of the kinds of things that are going on. This is very abstract, obviously. I thought it might be entertaining to show some less vague images of some parts of the system. So in collaboration with the inimitable Mike Ormsby from MPI, he developed as part of a CEBRA project, he developed this snapshot of all of the measures and all of the activities that are undertaken in New Zealand, again, to prevent the ingress of Queensland fruit fly on international travellers. And as you can see, there's actually a ton of factors that go into managing the risk of Queensland fruit fly. And I'll add as a footnote, we developed this, Mike developed this graphic as part of an exercise trying to model that pathway. And I think when I saw it, my little heart sank, because there's an incredible number of factors to include. So we vastly oversimplified to make it tractable. The thing I want to draw your attention to is all of the red boxes. Those are the border boxes, and everything that's not a red box is something that's relevant, but not at the border. So you can see there's quite a large number of activities going on that are relevant to managing the international risk of Queensland fruit fly, only some of which are at the border, and some of which obtain actually across a much larger range of pathways. So over to the right, you've got a number of activities there that are independent of the pathway upon which the QFF might have entered. And look, just for a further example, similar sort of deal, but now we're going to look at brown marmorated stink bugs coming in used vehicles. And the border is an even smaller number of activities relative to the incredible amount of activity that goes on to prevent the entry of BMSB via used vehicles. So, and again, quite a complex thing that we had to vastly oversimplify in order to make it tractable. But that's beside the point. The point is, what I want to underscore is that the border plays a role, but the border is not everything, and the border isn't impermeable. And I argue it's necessary for us to embrace these understandings in order to feel comfy about risk-based intervention. So those are my snapshots of what the border is and how the border fits into the broader biosecurity structure. Now, let's talk more about activities at the border. Border inspection or border intervention is carried out for various reasons with various goals. Firstly, well, and these are in no particular order. Okay, so when I say firstly, I just mean number one on the list. Border inspections carried, and I don't mean for this list to be comprehensive or exhaustive. So if I haven't captured a reason that you can think of that border intervention is undertaken, I'm eager to know it. Please pop it in the comments or raise it during question time. Firstly, to verify whether the current regulatory requirements or specifications are suitable for managing the biosecurity risk. Second, to verify that those requirements are being followed by stakeholders, by importers, and by bonds and carriers and so on. Thirdly, to provide evidence that the pathway risk is appropriately low. So in other words, that the risk is in the spec. Fourthly, to try to estimate the future risk that is presented by various activities, perhaps under counterfactual scenarios. Fifthly, to intercept biosecurity risk material, which is usually the big one that we think of. And finally, as a deterrence, to deter folks who might otherwise think, oh gosh, it's a good idea for me to try to break Australia's biosecurity laws, if they feel that there is a strong possibility that they will be detected, and that there will be a response that is fit for purpose, then that might act as a deterrent for them to do so. So there's 6 reasons to intervene at the border. And we can cluster those. And what I want to do is, firstly, I want to cluster them into sort of 3 sort of groups. And that would be to manage, to learn, and to deter. To manage, to block, and to deter. And secondly, I want to argue that the balance between those things necessarily varies between pathways. So what I've done is I've constructed a little triangle diagram, and this is almost purely to start a conversation and not in any sense to end one. What I wanted to do here was argue that the reasons that we inspect break down into these kinds of factors. Do we deter people from breaking the law? Do we block or intercept goods? Or do we manage the pathway by learning about the pathway, looking at is the pathway in spec? Are the requirements suitable? Are the requirements being followed? Does the consignment, for example, align with Australia's biosecurity regulations? And what I want to suggest is that the importance of those factors will vary depending on which pathway we're describing when we're thinking about intervention. And without wanting to pretend that this is a definitive take, I want to suggest, for example, that in the case of conveyances, which is our green dot here, there's not a lot of deterrence value in our intervention for conveyances because the supply chain is so complicated that the owner of the responsibility, the responsible party for the container, doesn't have a lot of control over what's happened before. So short of cleaning the container themselves, which of course is done in some systems such as the sea container hygiene system, they don't have a lot of control over the container cleanliness other than, inspecting it, etc. themselves. So then blocking biosecurity risk and managing or learning about the biosecurity risk is more important than deterring bad actors. I mean, conveyances typically are also contaminated by hitchhikers, more than necessarily cargo-specific pests, and unlikely that people are going to deliberately introduce hitchhikers into the pathway. Consequently, the deterrence value is low, I would argue, for conveyance inspection. For cargo, the deterrence would be higher, but not necessarily very high. But it's more about managing the pathway risk, less about blocking, and less about deterrence and more about learning about the pathway, I argue. And again, I'm happy to discuss this. I'm advancing the framework to continue a discussion about the relative balance without at all claiming that I've got this right. And with the male pathway, for example, that's the bluish one. Mostly it's about there's not very much deterrence. And it's hard to manage the male pathway because profiling is difficult. Country of origin isn't always available and isn't always necessarily very indicative of male risk. And travellers, on the other hand, there's a strong deterrence aspect to travellers and a management and somewhat less of a blocking interception style role. So with passengers, so I'm simply arguing that these different pathways are being subjected to inspections or interventions for different reasons, and I'm trying to capture those in this sort of triangular pathway sort of model. And again, so I welcome further discussion about that at the end of the presentation. But this has implications, and the implications, if we accept this principle, even if we accept that they're different and want to argue about the details, which I would enjoy, this has implications for the way we think about management. And the reason is that the different exercises, deter, manage, and block, scale differently, very differently in the pathways. And let me show you what I mean by that. So let's imagine we're thinking about the amount of effort that we undertake when we're thinking about blocking the pathway. We want to capture all of the biosecurity risk material and imagine that our effectiveness of inspection is 80%, just for the sake of argument. Then the amount of success we get scales linearly with the amount of the pathway that we intervene upon. So this is relevant because what this means is that if you want to block all of the biosecurity risk material on this pathway, and this is all else equal, okay, I'm not thinking right now about profiling, so let's set that aside just for the moment. You have to inspect all the pathway if you want to get all of it, and that's sometimes very expensive, and the rest of the time it's impossible. On the other hand, if you want to, so we're talking there about inspecting the percentage of the pathway and getting a return from the percentage on the pathway. On the other hand, if we're talking about deterrence, then to deter somebody from deliberately bringing in biosecurity risk material, you don't have to inspect the whole pathway. You have to inspect enough of the pathway, a large enough proportion of the pathway, that they will feel that they're likely to get caught or that their economic benefits suggest that they shouldn't try to break the law. And what that might mean is, let's imagine what an appropriate deterrent is. Let's call that D. And let's say if we inspect half the pathway, they'll think I've got a 1 in 2 chance of being caught. Then what we would do is we'd specify that the consequence would be 2 times D. And that way they're thinking, oh, well, the net effect of the risk means that I shouldn't do it. So then we're talking still about inspecting a proportion of the pathway, a large enough proportion of the pathway that that the outcome of detecting a non-compliance and being able to assign that to an entity acts as a deterrent, as an economic deterrence for them breaking regulations. Finally, and again differently, managing the pathway requires information about the pathway, and that's actually a statistical question. And that refers not to the proportion of the pathway that's inspected, but to the sample size, to the number of consignments. And this is very different because very, very large pathways with millions of consignments, if you can get a random and representative sample of them, you know what's happening on that pathway with a much, much smaller sample, maybe 1,000 units, maybe 5,000 units. If you can inspect one of 5,000 units, notably it's a count of units, then you get the information you need to manage the pathway, regardless of how large the pathway is. So the point I'm making here is that these three activities scale quite differently as a function of effort on the pathway. Blocking scales linearly. It's very inefficient. It's very inefficient. Deterring scales with diminishing returns in a way that depends on a range of factors, including how well it's advertised. I don't want to argue about whether that's better or worse than management. Probably not as good as management, but management scales with effort, measured as the number of, in fact, the square root of the number of consignments it's inspected. So it's a very different prospect. And that means that as you think about the difference, I'll just go back a moment, the difference between your goal of manage, deter, block in these different pathways, that might lead you to take different sample sizes. This is all relevant to compliance-based inspection. I'm just going to bring it all home. So what are the implications? The implication is that if your goal is to manage the pathway, you don't need to inspect all the pathway. And in fact, inspecting all of the pathway is not efficient. And the reason that this is material is because the management of the biosecurity risk is being taken about by the steps that are taken before the consignment is delivered. So the risk reduction activities are the pre-border activities or the pre-delivery activities, meaning pest-free area, meaning consignment treatment, meaning perhaps offshore inspection. All those activities, supply chain control, all those activities are reducing the biosecurity risk. And the role of inspection in that model is to verify. This is one of the numbers, the count I gave earlier. The role of inspection is to verify that the consignments are being appropriately managed. The risk is being appropriately managed pre-border. And this is where I want to argue that this kind of model is a little bit misleading, because what this model is saying is that the border is simply part of the filter. It's a slice of cheese, but actually it's a much more important slice of cheese because it's the border that gives the pre-border cheese its flavor, if I could put it that way. Without the border, the pre-border cheese might not be being applied. But if the border is there to check, to verify that these activities are being undertaken, then the pre-border cheese is having its full flavor and full impact. So that's where I think it's important to contextualize an image like this, because this implies that all slices of cheese are equal. But I want to argue that all cheese is not equal. And in fact, border cheese gives pre-border cheese its teeth. Okay, so let's go all this border stuff. This is the border stuff that's making the pre-border stuff good. Okay, we go back again. So then the question becomes, well, what if the pathway risk is appropriately low and you know it already? Well, you've got data that suggests it's low. And that's where something like risk-based intervention really shines. So we want the border to be watertight. That would be our ideal. Our ideal would be to say nothing gets through. But I want to also add that there's, in addition to the border giving pre-border teeth, there's another factor that we need to consider about the potential risk of invasive species entering through the border. And that is that there's a lot of ameliorative factors that play into the survival of an invasive species between when it breaches the border and when it establishes. Now, I don't know if you could hear scattered around the country sharp intakes of breath and the collective clutching of CEBRA pearls, because my team knows what a big fan I am of karaoke. But I want to give you comfort that I'm not going to sing that line. It's memorable, though. What I want us to reflect on is that not all border breaches will lead to establishment of a threat. It's unclear what proportion of establishments arise. We know that there's actually quite poor alignment between the nature of the pests that are intercepted in border intervention and the ones that are intercepted post-border and the ones that indeed establish, which suggests that doing more border isn't actually going to help us at all. But I want to reflect that there's actually a lot of factors that make it difficult for an invasive species to invade, whether it gets to the host material, whether it's in the appropriate climate, etc., etc. Thinking about the risk maps, for example, you can create. What proportion of the landscape is viable for an invasive species to get there if it gets there in appropriate numbers? It's not actually straightforward. And what this means is that even though we know stuff comes through the border, and we know it does, and even though when we hold that up against the fact that we don't have a crazy number of incursions, we've got a lot. I'm not saying we don't have a lot. I'm not saying we're not stretched. I'm not saying that our plant health friends aren't running around ragged, but we have less than you might expect if the border had no impact. And I don't think that's just dumb luck. I think it's actually harder for things to establish than might seem at first glance. Okay, so the consequence of that is that pathway management actually does make sense. That the role of the border as something to check on whether the pathway risk is being appropriately managed offshore actually really does make sense. And trying to use border inspection as a blocking measure does not make sense. It doesn't scale appropriately. Okay, so this brings us to risk-based intervention. And here's my classic delicious plate of dried apricots. We were asked, we meaning CERA back in the day, we were asked by Louise van Meurs whether there was any way of bringing some risk-based intervention magic to the management of the biosecurity risk of fresh fruits and vegetables and dried fruits as well. And we went back all the way to the 1940s, and we found an algorithm that's been used in manufacturing extensively, called the continuous sampling plan. Was written about in the 1940s by some mathematicians, and including folks who wanted to derive various characteristics of the plan, and has been implemented with great success in the 80 years since, across an incredibly diverse range of manufacturing and quality control activities. So it's a very natural match for the problem of how to decide what to do when a consignment arrives. Very natural match. Okay, here's the algorithm. I know I've had this slide up before. The algorithm basically is, the first one, the simplest one, is that we have a pathway. Let's think about a pathway such as dried apricots. and it can be in one of two modes. Census mode, which means we do the standard inspection of every consignment, or monitoring mode, which means that we randomly choose which consignments to inspect. We start the process off in census mode, and in that census mode, we inspect all consignments. So we in the apricots case, we impose a 600 unit sample on every consignment of apricots. And then let's imagine that we've chosen a number called C, which is how many passes we're going to need. Let's say it's 5. So in that pathway of these apricots, for example, from a particular supplier, we'll inspect all of them until we get 5 passes in a row. And at that time, we change that supplier to monitoring mode, and we randomly select a percentage of the consignments, and we inspect just that percentage. If any of those randomly selected and inspected with 600 units consignments leads to a fail, then they switch back to census straight away. And there's an equivalent specification there on the slide. But you could see that it's a process that you could implement in a spreadsheet if you wanted to. And in fact, for many years, New Zealand has been running certain pathways out of spreadsheets, which is very taxing for them, I must say. So that's CSP1. It's not very forgiving. It doesn't allow for the possibility that there could just be a spike or a little bit of trace non-compliance. It's saying consequences accrue as soon as you have a non-compliance. So I'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to talk about the two values, C and F, that I alluded to briefly. These are the tuning parameters, and they've caused a bit of heartache, I will say, amongst people trying to adopt CSP because they change the behavior of the algorithm. And that's important because you need to apply that algorithm at different levels, but it's also tricky because you want to know what are the implications of applying the algorithm at different levels and what's a fair way of doing it. And so what we want to think about is that the C value is how long the pathway spends in census mode. I've jokingly referred to that as purgatory here with a little sly religious reference. A high C value suggests that we need evidence that the pathway is back in specification. Lots of evidence. So that's saying, we're in census mode. I don't think 5 is enough. I want to see 20 consignments that are non-compliant, that are compliant before I move back. For example, that would be a high C mode. But that also creates a motivator, because if a supplier knows that they're going to be in purgatory again for 20 consignments, that's a long time to spend in census mode. That might be a motivation for them to not get there. High F, the F is a proportion of low risk consignments. It's inspected low risk, meaning the non-censused ones. These are all low risk, really, in our model. High F would suggest that we're worried that the pathway could flip to a sustained poor performance, and we want to catch that quickly. And that makes the algorithm more sensitive. So the more you inspect in the random sampling mode, the sooner you will detect a change to non-compliance. Now, I observed that CSP1 was sensitive or unforgiving. So a related version called CSP2 says, let's say we'll switch to census if there are any 2 fails within a number of inspections, K. So now we say, okay, if there's a fail, don't worry, keep calm, carry on, but we'll start counting. And if there's another fail within, let's say, 4 or 5 of the random inspections, then bang, you go to census mode. So what this does is it says, well, let's allow for the possibility that you've got a spike, like a random little increase or a random occurrence of non-compliance. We're not going to pull the trigger. We're just going to say, we'll keep calm. But if it happens twice, then we'll go. And of course, you can invent all kinds of variants that would involve 3 fails or whatever. You can make this as complicated as you want. That's more forgiving. The variant that the department chose is CSP3, which is CSP2, and if you get a fail, just census the next couple, just the next 3 or 4, just to be sure that it's just a one-off. So then we're saying we're going to flip to census mode if we have more than one fail within a given number of consignments, but also if we have a fail, we will census the next few consignments just to be sure. And there's a quick plot of how that looks. I'm not going to dwell on that because the algorithm itself isn't particularly important. Just think of it as a slightly more fastidious version of CSP2, which was a more accommodating version of CSP1. We're trying to find that sweet spot. So how did this play out within the department? And this is a really, to me, this is a really clutch graphic. What this shows us is not only how the number of pathways on CBIS gradually increases through time, going back from 2013, also it shows us the various steps that we had to take in order to get this implemented. We had a pilot, we had incentive testing, we had trialing importer reporting, we had economic field trials, we had engagement from ABARES, considerable engagement from ABARES, helping us in early days, trying to develop simulation models to choose values for these parameters, F and C. There were upgrades within AIMS to improve the automation. We built a parameter settings tool, and the whole process, well, it's still going. We're still engaging with the team. And that's a solid, let's say 12 years later, 12 years since the whole thing began. So this is important because what I want to acknowledge here is the incredible patience and sustained engagement that DAFF has shown to CEBRA, and also I would say our engagement, also coupling up with ABARES to deliver what seems like on the surface a really simple program. It's just this, but when we try to think about operationalizing it, there's a lot of activity that has to go on. And how is it playing at the moment? Recent figures say that there's been a total of 155,000 cumulative lines that have fallen under the aegis of CBIS, and about half of them, let's say, have been released from higher intervention by the CBIS program. So this is material because not only does this mean that DAFF is declining to inspect these low-risk pathways, so not only is that effort, that inspectorate effort, not going to waste, but also all of those consignments that are being released on docks aren't dwelling at the port. They're not lining up to wait for an inspection. They're not part of the queue. They're not being stored somewhere. So in addition to reducing inspectorate effort and the consequent costs, we're also making savings in the infrastructure that's needed to carry out good biosecurity risk mitigation. Now, I've got some up-to-date figures on the savings. These figures are actually lower than figures I've broadcast in the past. What's happened there is we've changed the way that we measure these impacts. So this is, I think, a better calibrated snapshot. Since the beginning of its program, it's saved 65,000 inspection hours and $14 million in intervention costs. And look, that's, as you can see from the cumulative graph, that's just growing. So this is really great news. What about taking the next steps? Well, a doughty team of mathematical statisticians in ABARES, Marty and Belinda, have taken on the flagship of theoretical development, and they're looking at ways of capturing, in a nutshell, ways of reporting and ways of planning CSP that take account of uncertainty and take account of variability and do so quickly. And so they've managed to take work that we did where we just did simulations, and they've managed to capture that in quite, I won't say simple because that sounds dismissive, but elegant equations that enable really rapid reporting that previously would have taken a day or 2 days to come up with some statistics, and they can get some great stats in seconds or less. So this is really good news, is that the innovation is being carried forward by these excellent folks in ABARES, and we're tracking it avidly because we're keen to see how this all plays. So that's the end of my material. I've generously left plenty of time for argumentation and discussion. I would welcome any comments, questions, or further thinking about how that pathway stuff plays out. Thanks so much for your attention today.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a great presentation. Very fascinating. I love the way you brought it together. So I really enjoyed that. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to put in the chat or to put their hands up, and I will throw to you. But to begin with, I probably have some. So how can compliance-based models evolve to incorporate emerging risks, technologies, and changing industry practices?
Oh, well, I love that question. So very insightful. So we talked about the ways in which you can tune the behavior of the pathway, the C and the F, and indeed the K. Now, one thing you can do is you can say, oh, a new technology's come online. This new technology changes the nature of the inspection or the ease of inspection. That's just going to change the way we handle the pathway. ABARES is doing a considerable amount of work linking those characteristics to pathway behavior and to the regulation of the pathway. So that's a means by which those can be introduced. The other thing is it's important for us not to assume that the algorithm, once developed, is something we merely are obliged to set and forget. In fact, if we are aware that there's been a change on the pathway, I would say we can go straight to census mode and say, let's find out what the impact of this change is. We don't have to wait for a supplier to trigger our decision rule. We can trigger that decision rule at any time. The goal behind CBIS is to provide an automated light touch way of seeing if there's a change we don't know about. But if there's changes we do know about, all of the regulatory apparatus that the department currently uses can absolutely be slotted right in.
Great, fantastic. Has anyone else got any other questions? If you wanted to put your hand up or throw them in the chat. I can see people are getting very excited about your song and going to have it stuck in their head all day.
You could tell the CEBRA team that unless they come up with questions, I might have to perform it to close out question time.
I love it. That's great. So I've got a question from James.
James, you're
Take myself off mute.
Yeah.
Hi, Andrew. Hi, everyone. Thank you. That was really interesting. And so obviously from New Zealand and part of MPI, and we do quite a lot of work, especially my team, around what we would call our verification systems, which a lot of what you said is just music to my ears. But in my experience as well, and I don't know if it's really a question, but more of a point, what we see is that when we have the kind of compliance-based or performance-based verification approach in place and it's performing really well, everybody, including industry and the regulator and others, get quite comfortable with not much happening. And then and I'm just interested probably more in your views on how do you deal with the shocks. So there's a typhoon overseas, or somewhere upstream in the pathway offshore, something's changed. You should be able to detect it, but then you don't have capacity to treat thousands of cars anymore, and just that contingency element. So I don't know if you've got any views on that.
Yeah, look, that's a super important question, James. And look, there's no cheap answer to that question. The fact of the matter is, we tend to calibrate our expectations of behavior based on peacetime. And all of the when the accountants go hunting for efficiencies, they say, well, half the hospital beds are empty, 95% of the time. Consequently, there's too many hospital beds, totally ignoring the fact that once in a generation, COVID will come along, and if you don't have enough hospital beds, folks are going to die. So this challenge, writ large, permeates our idea about efficiencies and the idea of whether it's worthwhile keeping capacity in reserve and sustaining that capacity and funding that capacity against the inevitability that there will be a higher call on our resources. Now, one way you could do that is you could have a workforce that is trained for multiple activities, some of which are done during peacetime and some which are done during wartime. If I could just use that analogy, I know it's uncomfortable at the moment, but it's all that's coming to. I wonder why it's all that's coming to my mind right now. And so there you might say, well, there are certain things that we undertake that are mission critical but are not urgent. And so I'm thinking about things like slippage surveys as an example, well, that's a good enough example, or maybe even inspection of very, very low risk activities. Then you might be saying, okay, well, I want my workforce to be doing those things, but I'm flexible enough to pull them out of the important but not urgent activities and inject them into the important and urgent activities until such time as I know what's going on. I mean, and that's not cheap, right? So that requires you to be running a workforce that has the capacity and capability to move flexibly within the constraints of the system. I would argue it probably also would make their jobs more interesting. But that's not for me to say. So yeah, a tricky one. But and I do think owning up. The short answer is we've got to own up to the fact that stored capacity is costly, and we need to pay that price.
Can I just make one observation as well, that it's interesting. I believe that you can also, if you apply the CBIS model to enough things, you'll get to a critical mass where your savings should allow you to then have the flexibility to respond. If it's broad enough, you might be responding to something else at the end of the year than what you did at the start. So that could perhaps be a bit self-fulfilling.
That's a great insight. And that is that if you're applying this to a diverse enough environment, then the independence of the shocks within the environment, much like an insurance program, could provide you some comfort. Agreed.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Great. And we've got a question from Tom.
Tom doesn't want me to sing.
No, that's for sure. Beautifully done, Andrew. Good grief, you're really good at the narrative. It's fantastic. Really well done. I just want to follow up on James's point because I'm all about pest pathways these days. And CEBRA has done a project both for New Zealand and for DAFF looking at the impact of global warming on trade patterns across the region, in fact, globally, and what that it would imply for pest pathways into Australia, given the changes in imports and so on across the world. So that's one thing that that we're looking at. But I guess I'm wondering, maybe we should do more of that, given James's point. I mean, we could, for example, model the impact of tariffs and what they do to trade patterns and pest pathways. Or maybe natural disasters, maybe not such a bad idea too, right? I'm just sort of wondering how far do you think we should push all that?
Wow. Well, I mean, there's the small WE, which is like CEBRA, and there's the big WE, which is like everybody here. Let me answer the second one. I think that's really important. These are credible threats to our ways of thinking about the risk that surrounds us, and there are credible prospects of change as a consequence of these. And by gum, we've got CEBRA happens to have developed a apparatus to assess the impact on pest pathways. I think it could be a very enlightening exercise. As you know, we spend our efforts where our stakeholders encourage us to. So if there's a stakeholder here who would like to encourage us to do that, well, we would do it with full force. Otherwise, we might have to just do it on the weekends.
Did you plan this in
Right, but
advance?
no, not at all. Not at all. But I think James's point was really telling. It was a really good point. I mean, we're missing a lot of potential applications looking at what happens around the globe. I mean, Trump tariffs are just one good example. And global warming is another, and natural disasters another. There's all kinds of things that one could do to sort of think about how risk profiles change given changes in pest pathways, given changes, in the rest of the world.
Right.
I think it's worth doing.
Right. Even if you look at, the possible increase of prices of fuel and what effect that might have on the movement of pests.
Good point. Really good point. Exactly. Thanks
Okay,
again, Andrew.
Thanks, Tom.
Have we got any other questions from anyone? Or I can't see any in the chat. So, okay, based on that, we might wrap up this wonderful presentation. So thank you very much, Andrew. Really appreciate your time and for you coming along and keeping us all informed of the amazing work that you're doing. So, hang on, we have a note. I think it was meant to be a clap and they put their hands up. So
I do want to, sorry, Jess, sorry for cutting in. I do want to, just before I close, I want to give us a big hat tip to Natasha for that outstanding joke in the chat that the pre-border, that the border makes the pre-border Gouda. That's okay. It's going to be harder, but all right.
Yeah,
that
it's hard to top that one. So just letting everyone know that those of you who have registered, the recording will be sent out shortly as soon as we've done the editing and things like that. And you can also view previous recordings on CEBRA's YouTube channel. So we hope to see you all again for the July CEBRAnar. So keep an eye out for details on how to register. And otherwise, have a fantastic day, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us.